Good morning and welcome to this webinar on low carbon liquid fuel options for reducing emissions from medium and heavy duty vehicles. We'll get introduction underway in a minute, but a few housekeeping matters. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A section or the chat. We'll do our best to address them. And if we have any questions regarding audio, etc., just send a private message to my colleague Faraz Shaki, who's our technical mastermind behind the scenes. If we're doing okay on timing, we will be pausing at several points through the webinar to have a Q&A on the topics that we've just presented. We will be recording the webinar and it will be available for presentation afterward. My name is Ian Thompson, past president of Advanced Biofuels Canada. I'll be hosting the webinar and introducing the speakers. Just right off the top, a shout out to Natural Resources Canada for assistance with this series called Navigating Clean Liquid Fuels. This support came from the Clean Fuels Awareness Program that will be running over the next year. The webinar is the second of 5 on low carbon liquid fuels. The campaign that we're running right now will increase awareness and understanding of how these are used across the sectors, and will be focusing on those through the next 4 quarters. We had a light duty vehicle webinar on March 31st. We are having this one on medium heavy duty today. Aviation. Aviation will be in September 2026, marine in Q4 of 26, and rail in Q4 of 2020, Q1 of 2027. There is a website you can see there, explore advancedbiofuels.ca, that is under development, but eventually we will see that with a full population of resources. I'm just checking with my colleague Farah. Farah, we can see slides okay?
Yes, I'm sharing the slides.
Excellent. Thank you. So we're going to do a quick poll right as we get underway here, just to track the impact of the webinars. And Farah, if you can run that, please. So you can see the webinar, the poll questions there. If you could just take 30 seconds to fill those out. We'll be doing the very same poll at the end of the webinar. Okay, it looks like we are at a 85%. Let's go to question 2. Great, Farah, are we good?
We're good.
Excellent. Okay, we're going to keep moving. Thank you for that. So just a bit about Advanced Biofuels Canada Association. We are Canada's national trade association for biofuels and renewable synthetic fuels. We've got 35 plus members. They are fuel producers and suppliers, both regional, and you'll hear from a couple of them today, and those with global platforms. And we also have a number of firms that provide services, including technologies to the sector. All of the fuels that we're going to talk about today are produced or distributed by our members. And Within the broad coverage of the association, we also have three caucuses, one for marine, one for aviation, and a third for renewable synthetic fuels, aka e-fuels or electric fuels. We also maintain formal reciprocal relationships with a number of other national low carbon fuel associations beyond Canada, and these are very helpful in informing our policy positions, understanding globally what's going on. When we started this association 2 decades ago, the list of technologies products, co-products was much smaller. Today's biofuel plants are true biorefineries with multiple streams of both inputs and outputs. Policy's been the biggest single driver for the proliferation of all of these technologies and products. An interesting side note here, development in recent years are that we're now seeing combinations of these types of products. For instance, biodiesel and renewable diesel blends are put together at 100% renewable, and they bring out the best properties of both of those fuels. Renewable naphtha can replace gasoline as a blend stock for E85 ethanol, and that's in considerable use in California. And that makes 100% renewable fuel. And then hydrogen combustion can be paired with renewable diesel for 100% renewable fuel, and we'll cover that today. Just right off the top, here's what we're covering. The agenda is as laid out. And I really want to make a couple of caveats. This is not an introduction or 101. On our website and those of others, you will find many really good resources. I know Scott Fenwick will have some good resources from the US side at the end of his presentation. Um, so go to those other sources. I mentioned the scope today is on liquid low carbon fuels. That would be primarily biodiesel, renewable diesel, and we'll have a brief touchdown on co-processed renewable fuels, and we covered that in the last webinars. E-fuels are also in scope as a liquid fuel, but we don't have those fuels in commercial application on the road in Canada, so no real deep dive there. I'm also going to note that there are ample resources available from our colleagues on the other fuel types in the Canadian Biogas Association, the Coalition for Renewable Natural Gas, as well as the Canadian Hydrogen Association and the E-Fuels Alliance. And we would be happy to provide follow-up contact information for those after the webinar. I think that's it. If you've got questions afterward, we'll deal with them. So here's who you're going to see today. I'm just immensely grateful to have with us experts ranging across all aspects of the fuel use. Their full bios, by the way, are on the website that we put up earlier, explore.advancedbiofuels.ca. At a technical level, off the top, we're going to have Scott Fenwick with the Clean Fuels Alliance America give us a deep dive into their extensive experience and work on biodiesel and renewable diesel. We'll hear from a distributor operating in Canada and the EU, that's Greenergy, a leading Canadian municipal fleet, the City of Vancouver, and a technology provider, Optimus. So uh, that's the coverage on the technical side. We'll also get a kind of a big picture synopsis perspective from two executives from Canadian trade associations, the Canadian Fuel Alliance and Advanced Biofuels Canada. Just some before we dive in, this is kind of a bit of context. So in December 2021, we hosted a biomass-based diesel webinar. Scott joined us for that. And I went back and reviewed that, and it's really clear that in the 4.5 years since then, a lot has changed. Some steps are undeniably forward. For instance, we have the clean fuel regulations in Canada. That's a clear gain. And then we have some steps that are backwards and providing a challenging environment. Medium heavy duty decarbonization is proving to be a harder nut to crack from a regulatory point of view than light duty vehicles. And maybe one of the largest challenges today is in this space is diverging Canadian and US policy and questions about to what extent Canada can go it alone. So, off the top, the EPA is making a number of sweeping changes on things like tailpipe emission standards, which Canada follows and mirrors because we're under the North American vehicle production platform with Mexico, and all of our vehicle types are harmonized, and Canada has traditionally followed the EPA's lead. So the rulemaking in that space is on hold. We have in the US, federal funding and infrastructure funding has been delayed or curtailed. We do have federal 45W tax credits for commercial EV remaining intact. And then in California and in Oregon and in Washington and other places that have followed the lead of California on its waiver of the Clean Fuel, the Clean Air Act provisions, we're seeing a lot of those provisions, the Clean Trucks Rule, the Clean Fleets Rule, on hold right now while they are being challenged in court and the Congress coming down on those. In Canada, we've seen pullbacks in some places, but we do have some programs still in place. Quebec's got continuing programs that support the medium and heavy duty sectors. In British Columbia, the Clean BC Go Electric rebates have been paused. And just checking the website yesterday, that updated framework is going to be released sometime later this year. We still have high-speed charging station support. Big picture, and Dave and Fred can speak to this later, but we have the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East are really repivoting to conventional energies as energy security becomes a critical and affordability becomes a critical one. Broad pullback on climate targets, both in government and the ESG targets with industry affordability. And then we're also seeing national and subnational government budgets challenged. So we've got a very different environment than we had 5 years ago. I would say high level, the clean fuel reg in Canada is driving an awful lot of activity. And so that's a big plus. And Canada's provinces continue to maintain their provincial clean fuel regs. Just a quick note on the role that biofuels play, and specifically those directed at the heavy duty sector, but true for ethanol too. Um, this is forgotten, but in an era of tight energy supplies and the current geopolitics, more fuel availability provides security, but it provides affordability. And we can provide you with the links here, although they were in a March 2026 press release that our office sent out. But we have a number of studies that show when you add more fuel to the mix, it suppresses price increases. And we have those data. That's simple price elasticity of supply. We also have biofuels, and this is a report from the Canadian Fuels Alliance, the Canadian Fuels Association, the impact on biofuels to the Canadian economy. We're going to talk a little bit about the impact on the Canadian agricultural sector. On the right, you can see just the cumulative cost impact by source, and I would point you to the Biofuels in Canada report from Navius research on that one. Dichotomies that we have run into in the heavy duty sector. Oftentimes you have higher upfront costs in exchange for lower operating costs. Sometimes you have the owner that is investing in the technology be a different person than the operator who may get the payoff of using the technology. And then certainly in long haul, you get one or two unit owner operators up against large fleets. All of these are operating north-south to some degree, more so large fleets. And so the degree to which the owner operator of a medium or heavy duty, and we're probably talking more class 7 and 8 long haul, is going south of the border, they're going to have to account for infrastructure and fuelability there going forward. One interesting note, and I think this was also in our March news release, is that the war in the Middle East has really laid out the degree to which biofuels have been impacted relative to refined petroleum product. I'm using the feedstocks for both WTI crude. Western Canada Select would demonstrate similar properties up against the feedstocks for both for the primary feedstocks for both for heavy duty, for biodiesel, renewable diesel, canola futures, and soybean oil futures. So there's been some degree of insulation from the impacts of geopolitics on the biofuels. And interestingly, where biofuels do tick up, it is from the inputs of things like fertilizer and diesel fuel, which are both obviously fossil derived. Just a note too, what's been the impact of policies and build out of biomass-based diesel fuels. You can see here British Columbia has the most robust and timely databases in Canada for reporting on the impact of its British Columbia low carbon fuel standard. And this is from the annual summary that is put out, plus or minus 6 months after the end of every year. There are monthly credit reports, but we're not drawing from that. And you can see how policy has really driven the reduction in carbon intensity of the fuels. And anybody who knows about how low carbon fuel standards work will know that it's not only obligated parties that have to reduce the carbon intensity of their fuels to stay kind of on side, but if you are a low carbon fuel producer and supplier to a standard, you also have to continually be innovating in the carbon intensity to stay relevant, or your relative importance starts to shrink. So some interesting data there. We're going to just have a quick run of a video that will demonstrate the degree to which the biofuels production adds to local economies. And the same could be said of prairie agriculture, with canola going into large biofuel plants there. But this video is focused on more what regional plants in British Columbia and in Quebec are doing. And if I could have Farah, you could roll that.
Donc, nous sommes un producteur plus petit dans la gamme des producteurs qu'il y a. Nous développons des relations avec nos fournisseurs de matières premières et qui sont aussi des producteurs régionaux, qui sont aussi souvent des producteurs qui ont la même taille que nous. Et de cette façon-là, nous développons des relations avec eux autres qui leur permettent de maximiser leur valeur. Puis nous leur fournissons le service aussi d'aller chercher la matière au moment où elle est, d'avoir le service. Alors, nous avons cette relation symbiotique entre les fournisseurs et nous-mêmes. De la même façon, nous fournissons le carburant à des distributeurs de carburant régionaux, peut-être plus petits, mais qui cherchent un fournisseur qui est à leur taille et qui leur fournit, et dans lequel nous développons des relations à long terme.
I drive about an hour to work each day, and I probably pass maybe 10 to 15 of our clients. I see their trucks on the road, so it's quite interesting seeing that very, very exact impact that you're having, as opposed to just selling it overseas or exporting it and not actually seeing the end users using it. Our biggest challenge is access to local feedstock, because we are in a global market. So a lot of the feedstock, we are competing against both Canadian and American companies exporting that feedstock and using it for their plants. So it's something that has grown. It's certainly not going away, but also we try and sort of play on that local angle that we're keeping that feedstock and having it produced here in British Columbia. The local pub that I go to, they have a drum of used cooking oil there, which is the used cooking oil supplier, one of them that we purchased from. And so it's great to be able to see that used cooking oil get picked up in that drum, chucked in a vacuum truck, reprocessed, sent to our facility, and then we're turning that back into biodiesel. On my drive to work, get to see all these trucks using our biodiesel. So that's kind of how the circular economy works.
Les opérations de Inoltech au Québec permettent de supporter des producteurs de gras animal, des producteurs des usines de fabrication d'aliments ou des restaurants et des collecteurs d'huile. Et ça permet de réinjecter puis de participer dans les réglementations, que ce soit au niveau canadien, que ce soit au niveau du Québec ou de l'Ontario. Et à ce niveau-là, nous contribuons à rencontrer les objectifs de changement climatique et de réglementation sur la réduction des intensités carbonées des carburants.
Real decarbonization is starting to become a real issue for a lot of companies. They're getting a lot of pressure from local shareholders or part of larger international companies. The sectors that show the most promise would be in the mining industry, local shipping companies, as well as local fleets. They get a lot of pressure from shareholders, whether those be local shareholders care about the environment or part of larger international firms which have decarbonization goals. We're kind of, flying that Canadian flag, local supplier. We increase production, we're hiring more people, that's going back into the economies. Really, really excited to see what happens in the next couple of years.
Excellent. Thanks to Consolidated Biofuels and Ineltech for those vignettes. As is one of our learnings across the years is that if you want to maintain political support for biofuels, it's critical to be able to demonstrate local and regional economic impact, and we certainly get that from relatively smaller biofuel plants that are part of a circular economy in Canada's big cities, but you also get it from the agricultural sector where in times of challenging trade dynamics, biofuels can provide a critical market for canola farmers, soybean farmers, etc. So diving ahead, there you go. We are going to, I'm going to leave this behind as a takeaway, and this is abridged and circuit. Some of these are going to be more estimates, but this is kind of right off the top what the history of biodiesel and renewable diesel has looked like in Canada. 2002, City of Brampton and Toronto Hydro already kicked off with B20. Ontario had a tax exemption. Everything kind of rolled out from there. The firm that I previously was with was instrumental in working, I will note, with Dave Schick, who was at Chevron at the time in the Greater Vancouver area and Alberta on some work there. One thing that I'm going to note here, and you're going to hear a fair bit from Johannes Dunn at Greenergy about their B20 work. You're going to hear from Scott Fenwick about CFAA's work on biodiesel. I sometimes will call Canada the land that time forgot when it comes to biodiesel blends. In the pre-2010 era in British Columbia and Alberta and Ontario, we had a considerable number of fleets running on B20. Chevron Dave, I believe, put in the first inline blending ratio blending rack in Canada in Burnaby. There was a big push on B20 in the 2010-2012 era. Canada and its provinces brought in a range of low carbon and renewable fuel standards, and the compliance blend basically dropped to B2, went into everything, and the higher level blends disappeared. We had some challenges with the blender's tax credit in the US on and off again, and we also lost some of the tax exemptions available for higher level biofuel blends. So I will note that particularly in the case of biodiesel, and I will note, by the way, look there in 2006, 2008, we had the cold soak test came into the CGSP biodiesel standard, and that addressed issues of gelling in temperatures above the cloud point, which is not supposed to happen. Today's biodiesel is a really modern fuel, and it was not a modern fuel when we first rolled it out in Canada. So I will just make note of that. It's a bit of a historical footnote, but an important one. When we're talking medium heavy duty vehicles, this is what we're talking, and it's slightly different for the US. So we've got class 3 to 6 are medium, and these are not just by fuel type, sometimes they're by weight and load, but these are the broad categories. And you can see the gross vehicle weight rating there. Heavy 7 and 8, but address things like dump trucks and cement haulers, etc. And then heavy conventional freight, et cetera, et cetera. So these are, as you can see, in 2023, 26% of Canada's transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions, despite being a relatively small number of on-the-road fleets. So that's the fleet profile that we're talking about. Lastly, before we get underway with Scott, we have a microsite called Net Zero Clean Fuel CA, and we put that up to describe the potential for energy-dense, low-carbon liquid fuels to achieve zero or near zero emissions. And this schematic provides a snapshot of common and emerging pathways for advanced fuel production. And they cover all of the fuel types that we are talking about today. From an end user point of view, these pathways will produce either a fully fungible drop-in fuel or a partially drop-in fuel. And renewable diesel and e-fuel would be a good example of fully fungible fuels, no engine modification. Both, of course, would have to meet the low carbon ratings, as would hydrocarbon fuel diesel. Biodiesel and ethanol are examples of fungible fuels that have blend limits depending on the engine type and age and application and weather. So if you want to get a full description of what those different technologies look like, you can go to netzerocleanfuels.ca. Okay, without further ado, we're going to kick into our first speaker, and we're really fortunate today to have Scott Fenwick with CFAA. Folks will know CFAA as the National Biodiesel Board until a few years ago, and Scott and his colleagues have been longtime supporters of our work here in Canada. CFAA is Canada is the trade association for biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuels across Canada and the States and North America. And Scott leads the core member services on technical QA, and et cetera. One thing I really do want to note with Scott is the chair of the ASTM DO2 committee, and folks who know ASTM, that's not just biofuels, that's the whole distillate committee. So, and Scott is an award-winning acknowledged person in ASTM. So, Scott, over to you. Great to have you again.
Thanks, Ian. Pleasure to be here with you today and all of your participants, and hopefully this will be informative for them. If we want to go to the next slide. A couple notes. Again, I had the privilege of serving, as Ian mentioned, as the committee chair, ASTM Committee D2, covering all petroleum products, liquid fuels, lubricants. I continue to serve on ASTM's board of directors. I've served and participated actively within CGSB, as well as ISO on a number of international standardization activities. But I would be remiss if all of that is from the support of our farmers, their checkoffs, and our membership at Clean Fuels. And so they're the ones that provide me the opportunity and the funding resources to take on a lot of the projects that we do and we'll talk about today. Next slide. Renewable fuels, biomass-based diesel fuels are still a regulatory-based fuel, needing support. Within the US, that support on the federal level comes from the Renewable Fuel Standard, or RFS. Recently, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency here in the US, just a couple months ago, released the 2026-2027 Renewable Volume Obligations, or RVO. And so those are what are driving our industry. And for the first time in the US, we have had a significant increase in those obligatory gallons. Clean Fuels had been arguing and advocating for 5.25 billion gallons here in 2026. For the first time, we actually received more than what we had requested. The bare minimum values here for 26 and 27 are 5.4, 5.7. But if you take into account the small refinery exemptions that they've recently announced, as well as some other factors, we believe that 2026, the volume obligation is going to be a lot closer to 6 billion gallons this year. And in 2027, even higher, upwards of over 6.5, maybe even closer to 7 billion gallons, depending upon that ratio of biodiesel and renewable diesel production and the RIN generations. Next slide, please. So again, still within the federal program, feedstock availability is the largest concern within our industry. Groups such as the American Soybean Association, NOPA, they are suggesting there are going to be sufficient volumes of domestically available feedstocks, and domestically really within North America. There was a proposal that's been shelved by EPA about half of a RIN, or renewable identification number, being generated for feedstocks outside of North America. But EPA has put that off until 2028 when they say they'll address that. The other important aspect of this, we had a switch at the end of 2024 into 2025. Previously in the US, there was the biodiesel blenders credit, otherwise known as 40A, that effectively gave $1 per gallon for gallons of biodiesel and renewable diesel. At the end of 24, part of the legislation passed by US Congress, that transitioned into the Clean Fuels Producer Credit, or 45Z. Now it's no longer a blender's credit, it is a producer's credit. It's no longer a check back to the submitter as well. Now it is transferable, but it is a reduction in tax liability. And so it only applies to North American feedstocks and US produced fuels, so that's different as well. And there are some considerations. You have to utilize the US GREET model, of which there was just a new version published here about a week ago that no longer takes into account indirect land use change. So we're seeing the value of that 45Z credit significantly improve over the last several years. And what now will be for roughly those veg oil feedstocks for soy, canola, depending upon that carbon intensity score, could be about 60 to 65 cents per gallon. For lower CI feedstocks, that value may be a little bit higher. So next slide, please. So with all of that, it's suffice to say that these RFS2 volumes are going to lead the renewed expansion and increased volumes here in the next couple of years in the US. Obviously, policy will continue to play an important factor, both in available feedstocks and utilization of those, and the choice of whether or not the finished fuels that are produced. We're a huge believer that the market will figure this out. We're waiting, we'll begin providing information and data back to the US government on a potential 2028 volume proposal. We'll contribute to those discussions on the half RIN, but certainly the next administration is going to have their own set of requirements as well. Next slide, please. So on to the technical program. As technical director for Clean Fuels, my role is to proactively address these technical issues for biomass-based diesel fuel, primarily biodiesel, across 3 different programs. And we have those here on the screen. Our quality assurance, which is a larger umbrella program where we can proactively address issues that arise day to day in the marketplace. We also work very closely with OEMs, those vehicle and engine manufacturers, both with and without diesel platforms. So companies like Cummins, Caterpillar, even on light duty, as Ian showed, GM, Ford, Toyota, which officially does not have a diesel engine here in the North American market currently. But in doing so, in covering these markets, we want to ensure that biodiesel, renewable diesel can be used in higher volumes, higher blends, not just in on-road applications, but off-road, those ag and construction equipment, locomotives, marine, heating oil, and even to a lesser extent, power generation. Now, EPA in that latest RVO that they announced back in March did clarify that the RFS is specifically for transportation fuels, with limited exceptions like heating oil. And if you are utilizing biomass-based diesel fuels for electrical or power generation, all of these data centers that are popping up across the US and around the world, those are ineligible to generate RINs. So next slide, please. Some of the technical advances. Again, we've made a lot of changes. As Ian said, 20 years ago, biodiesel had its challenges, both from a quality and performance perspective. That's no longer the case. We've made great strides. And in fact, Clean Fuels has been publishing on an annual basis since about 2017, part of our BQ 9000 program, an annual report on the quality of biodiesel in the US and Canada under that BQ 9000 program. But fuel composition is changing, but even more so are engine technologies. And you're going to hear more from Colin with Optimus Technologies on their use of higher blends, B100, in the marketplace. But the good thing is these biomass-based diesel fuels in older engines, Tier 3 and older, can reduce tailpipe emissions, those criteria pollutants. Those lead to lower levels of soot and health benefits. And even in the newer Tier 4 engines, that lower soot can lead to fewer diesel particulate fuel regens on the latest equipment. There's a significant amount of increased interest now in blends above B20. John Deere just recently announced here in the US B30 approval in all of their Tier 4 equipment, and that comes on top of B100 approval for all of their Tier 3 and older equipment that doesn't have emissions after treatment systems. Recently, even in Canada, Transport Canada just announced approval of B30 in the marine applications as well, without additional testing. And so significant interest. Have ASTM meetings next week in Chicago where we'll be discussing standards for those. Currently, we don't have a B30 standard, B30 spec, but we'll be introducing such here over the next year or so. Those blends, whether it's biodiesel and renewable diesel together, individually, have increased performance benefits as well as GHG reduction. Renewable diesel, for instance, has the potential, it's not a guarantee, offer superior cold weather performance, even in some cases better than a winterized ULSD here in the US. We've recently been working with additive manufacturers as well. We have a couple commercial additives here in the US where we can provide that same winter performance, that same cold weather operability on B50 blends with certain feedstocks that they would receive from a winterized ULSD as well. Next slide. So we talk about technical and performance considerations. One of the things that leads to that is the higher cetane number that comes with biodiesel and renewable diesel. Depending on feedstocks, for biodiesel, could be anywhere from approximately a 40 cetane or 50 cetane. With renewable diesel, you're much higher, even at 80, potentially 85, versus that spec for ULSD at 40. That higher cetane translates to better combustion. Better combustion means those lower criteria pollutants that we talked about, soot, carbon monoxide, aromatics, total hydrocarbons, even NOx in a lot of cases, and greenhouse gas emissions. Now, there are differences in Tier 3 and older equipment versus Tier 4. Tier 4 with emission systems, the emission systems and the hardware take care of a lot of that. But as we've talked about, fuels like biodiesel improve lubricity, leads to better performance of today's high pressure common rail engines, and that those lower soot emissions provide better performance of the emission systems, particularly the DPF. Next slide, please. So some of the other things that we're working on is that better performance. So because of the shorter chain lengths and the limited boiling range of these biomass-based diesel fuels, they come with slightly less energy content. Now, for biodiesel and renewable diesel, for biodiesel in particular, it's about 9% less energy content for B100. But once you blend that, it's linear. And so a B20 is only going to be about 1.8% less energy content. Now, just to give you a sense of what that means for fuel economy, uphill, into the wind, having a heavier foot that particular day, quick starts at a stoplight or stop sign equates to about 2% differences in fuel economy. Now, what we also believe is that the improved combustion from both renewable diesel and the oxygen content in biodiesel, that improved combustion can also help improve the recovered work from these volumes. And so it may help lessen the impact on fuel economy. In fact, some of our latest studies are actually showing that B100 use can actually, in certain engines, have an increased fuel economy in some cases. But either the case, biomass-based diesel fuels definitely have lower life cycle GHG emissions, depending on which model and which regulatory requirements you're looking at, anywhere from 80 to 95% or slightly higher reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. These fuels are considered drop-in. There is no changes not needed to the engine for use with B20, B30 blends, renewable diesel slightly higher, no changes in infrastructure needed as well. And so they are drop-in solutions today that are cost effective. Now, that doesn't go without saying, all fuels today, as opposed to what was used 30, 40 years ago, require due diligence and good housekeeping, no matter the fuel. This goes without saying, not just for renewable fuels, but even the diesel fuel in use today is susceptible to water accumulation, free water fallout, which then leads to microbial growth and corrosion. Next slide, please. So under our quality assurance program, we have our BQ9000 quality management system. We're currently working on long-term stability. A lot of the vehicle and engine manufacturers would like to see a higher spec for stability, but that doesn't necessarily translate to shelf life in storage. I mentioned housekeeping is so important today, keeping those fuels clean and dry, making sure there's no rust will help improve the stability and shelf life of your fuels. But we have been working on antioxidants and their applicability in the marketplace. We do have projects where we have demonstrated the ability to re-additize fuels in the marketplace to improve stability. We're also working with BD and RD blends, 100% renewable fuel, offering you improved performance in the marketplace with today's engines. There are concerns about some of these minor components with biodiesel, but we're working on that to reduce the risk associated with fallout, and there may be additive solutions as well. Emissions testing, we're concerned about metals contamination. And again, not just necessarily with renewable fuels. There are specifications for biodiesel to cover metals content, but metals can contaminate all fuels. And so what are the impacts of those in today's engines? We're working to improve OEM approvals, not necessarily warranties, and I'll cover that a little bit here in a minute, but also then B30 demonstration projects with John Deere and other vehicle and engine manufacturers. Recently, just earlier this year on our BioHeat project, their use in heating oil applications, ASTM just published a revision to D396, provides a new grade that covers biodiesel blends up to B50 in today's heating oil applications. We're also working with those equipment manufacturers and their certifications through organizations like ETL or Underwriters Laboratory. They are now certifying all of their equipment with use of up to B100. And then later this year, NORA, or the National Oil Heat Research Alliance, is going to be publishing a paper demonstrating that 100% renewable fuel use in heating oil applications is possible. They're going to outline studies with B50, R50, R80, B20, where they are providing adequate, effectively better or improved performance in today's home heating applications. Next slide. I mentioned we're tracking OEM approvals. We track that for both biodiesel and renewable diesel. That's here on our website at cleanfuels.org. And each one of those listings is actually a hyperlink back to the OEM's webpage where you can see for yourself where they're at. Now, that's not to say companies like Detroit Diesel or even John Deere. What we have listed here may be dependent upon certain engines, certain applications, seasons, and geographies. And so it's important to understand exactly where that OEM position lies. Next slide, please. But back to warranties. I want to be clear about this. Vehicle and engine manufacturers do not warranty the use or void warranties for the use of any type fuel. Engine warranties cover parts and workmanship. Those aspects that are under the purview, under the control of that vehicle or engine manufacturers. Warranties cover failed parts, improper assembly, but not fuel-related issues. That's important to note. So if and when you do have an issue, noting whether or not it is fuel-related. Typically, an OEM is going to be very quick to blame the fuel and cause that, tell the consumer this is a fuel-related issue. By doing so, it ensures that that OEM is not responsible because, as I mentioned, warranties do not cover fuels. So if an issue actually is fuel-related, it would be the responsibility of the user or the fuel supplier. Next slide, please. So we're working on a lot of the issues today. Again, as a trade association here in the US, we want to take on those projects that our members alone may or may not have the ability to undertake. But understand, future fuels and the headlines that you're seeing today are always looking ahead further and further into the future. We realize that administration, policy dependent, there may be a push towards higher levels of electrification. That means wind, solar, coal, even nuclear power may become more and more at the forefront of certain policies. But make no mistake, we are not ready to transition to 100% electrification, particularly for the transportation industry. You'll hear a lot about ethanol and methanol. Those are huge topics right now in the marine industry, and ISO is working on specifications for those fuels in international marine environments. Ammonia, hydrogen, novel feedstocks, and processes are all going to be talked about in headlines and stories today. So it's important to get to the bottom of what actually is capable in today's marketplace and what is going to be future. Now, my crystal ball doesn't work as well as it may all the time. So it's hard for me to tell you how far out is ammonia, how far out is 100% electrification. That's certainly going to depend upon future administrations, future policies, legislation, as well as regulations. But the market will certainly figure that out. The Governing Board of Clean Fuels proposed roughly 7 years ago. We were hoping to build the biomass-based diesel industry in the US to 6 billion gallons by 2030. And as I shared that RVO with you, we're going to be several years ahead of that projection. But additionally, with advances in feedstock, we think that we can grow the biomass-based diesel industry to 15 billion gallons by 2030. Next slide, please. Fuel cleanliness is of critical importance. And so as additional resources, Clean Fuels posts a liquid fuel handling guide, as well as what was the National Renewable Energy Lab, now the National Lab of the Rockies, their biodiesel and handling and use guide, that 6th edition that was published a couple years ago. These are additional resources for you to utilize and hopefully help with your applications and your use of renewable fuels today. Next slide, please. With that, I want to thank you and note there are a lot of things coming in the future, but if you do have sustainability goals, carbon intensity reductions, liquid renewable fuels are the lowest cost drop-in solution available to you today to reduce carbon while adding additional performance benefits to your fleet. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Always great to hear what CFA is working on, and thank you for your work south of the border. We are certainly beneficiaries of all of that work on technical. If we could pop to the next slide, my pleasure to introduce Johannes Dunn. And Johannes is the head of compliance and commercial and compliance for Green Energy Canada. It's part of the Green Energy Group, an international transportation fuel supplier of traditional and renewable fuels. And Johannes leads their regulatory strategy and commercial execution. We tap his knowledge considerably, and we are particularly interested in the model that green energy has developed across Canada for making access to renewable fuel blends easier for fleets and others. Johannes, over to you.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. Thanks for joining today. My name is Jonas Dunn. I lead our commercial and compliance program for Green Energy Canada. Today, I would like to share some practical observations from our experience deploying, biodiesel and biodiesel blends within the Canadian market. Rather than focusing on future technologies, I'll focus on what we've been seeing today in the real world applications and how proven technologies are helping to reduce emissions using existing fleets and infrastructure. Next slide, please. Yeah, so quick little bit of background. Green Energy as a global entity has been operating for more than 30 years, and we entered the Canadian market back in 2013. What's important is not the size of the company, it's the actual experience that we brought with us when we decided to make that move into the Canadian market. Before entering, we spent many years working with biodiesel production, blending, the actual transportation logistics, not just the actual finished product, but also the feedstocks that we require to source from various locations in Europe to feed the plants that we have there still today. And then we saw that as an opportunity, having those knowledge and understanding of the product, that we could bring that to the Canadian market and offer a practical low carbon fuel solution. And we can add value that way to customers. There's one of our guiding principles that's very simple, and to this day we still stick by it. We don't go where we're not needed. We saw a market opportunity where our infrastructure and our know-how and how to produce and handle biodiesel efficiently, and that experience, we saw that as something that we can bring towards this new market that was Canada for us back in 2013. When I personally moved to Canada 8 years ago from our UK operations, the one thing that stuck with me is the scale of the country. I know it sounds silly, second biggest country in the world, Canada, but you don't really realize how big it is. The fact that you can fly from the East Coast, where I'm based, to Vancouver, and that's technically a further flight than going to Europe or some places in Europe. That distance really matters. So yeah, I think if you go to the second slide, that brings me to why biodiesel continues to be relevant today. One of our biggest misconceptions, I think Scott touched on it, is that biodiesel is a new technology. It really isn't. It's been around commercially for many decades and has evolved significantly over time. Fuel quality standards have improved. The supply chains have matured. Some of the videos we saw earlier showed how that circular supply chain to the end user has been established, and also industry knowledge have certainly increased over the last 2 decades. Today, the discussion is less about whether biodiesel works and more about how we deploy it and effectively and to scale. I think scale is a key word to remember in this discussion. That is why Canada and its size is really key for us as a provider of road fuels. The industries that need to carry a lot of goods in the Canadian landscape requires vast distances to travel. And a lot of them are still traditional diesel powered equipment, similar to what Scott was pointing out on his slide there earlier. So what does it matter for Canada specifically? Well, those traditional engines remain the workhorse of our economy. Trucks, also locomotives, marine vehicles, vessels, mining equipment, all those heavy machinery that continue to serve the Canadians for many years to come, in my opinion. They are the ones that can really use this product already without any changes to technology and infrastructure. So the question isn't whether new technologies will emerge. They certainly will. I think Scott had a list there on things that's on the map as well. The question is more about how we reduce emissions today, with the equipment we have and that is currently in operation. That's why biodiesel can play an important role. We've also seen growth and demand where customers are looking for practical, I think Ian, you touched on this earlier, solutions to meet certain, targets, sustainability commitments, policy. Sometimes that's the driving factor. And sometimes it's just simply customers looking for a low carbon option that fit with existing operations without the need to change anything. We've certainly seen that shift happen, especially in our Ontario footprint over the last few years, where the conversation went from, what is biodiesel, or we having to explain to customers what biodiesel is, from that point to them asking, how can I use it? What's the blends available? Where do I start? That's the kind of shift that's really happened over the last few years. The strongest interest, I think you touched on it earlier, is that kind of sector where electrification is really a challenge. Heavy transportation, I mentioned mining and marine and rail before. These sectors often use or need solutions that work with existing assets and infrastructure. And we've seen in the early parts of our time in Canada that adoption of the P20 into fleet and cardlock applications. That has been very successful, and we also have seen now higher blends into the mining and marine sectors as well. So what does that tell us? It tells us that there's not one size fit all solution. Different sectors will adopt different technologies and fuels based on their operational requirements. Of course, whether new fuels are there to help us, new technologies, that's for sure. But in the meantime, that is how we meet the targets that's in front of us in the short term. If you can just go to the next slide. So I think when there's a discussion about new fuels, there's one thing I always want to highlight, and I think, Scott, you touched on maintenance. There's always this question, new fuels, what's the challenges with it? The thing that always comes up when you talk biodiesel is that kind of maintenance. What does it do with the tanks and so forth? Well, the thing is, biodiesel actually help with cleaning deposits that's accumulated in fuel systems over time. That's a fact. That's generally a good thing or a positive thing. However, during transition period, it really is critical that operations deploy, close attention, good processes, and maintenance in their systems. And that goes for every product and every fuel. It's not just a fuel issue, that's a housekeeping issue. So good tank maintenance, really monitoring the filters that you use is a key important step towards transitioning or just any fuel that you have in your system. So when customers understand that and they apply good management practices, we see a very successful rollout of biofuel blends across various applications. So where does biofuel fit into the bigger picture? If you can just go to the last slide. I think there's multiple ways of hitting our targets over the next few years. That energy transition requires multiple solutions. Different sectors will move at different speeds, and different regions will adopt different technologies. That is a fact. What matters is finding practical ways to reduce emissions today while continuing to build toward longer-term solutions. From our perspective, biodiesel is one of those tools that's available today that can help reduce emissions in existing fleet and infrastructure. If there's one message I can leave to this group today, is that biodiesel is not a new technology. It's a proven technology. The challenge today isn't about proving if it works. The challenge today is deploying it efficiently and at scale. That word again, scale, is key. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johannes. That's a great view of your work across Canada and other places on supplying low carbon fuels to fleets. And we're fortunate to have a number of companies in our membership and in the Canadian space who are doing similar work to bring that out. So thank you. My pleasure. Up next is Nadine Morris, and Nadine, as the slide says, is the senior fleet manager engineer at the City of Vancouver. She's with the engineering and asset management team, and she does fuel asset management, analytics, supply and integration of conventional and renewable fuels, and covers the planning and deployment of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So Nadine covers a lot of ground. She is a professional engineer, and she is of that breed of professional engineers called mechanical engineers, which make the world go round. So we're delighted to have Nadine with us. I'm going to, just next slide, I'm going to just butt in line just a little bit ahead of Nadine to say City of Vancouver has really been a leader in this space for many years. In 2003, I secured a small grant to do some emissions testing as part of a small 6 fleet pilot of B20 and City of Vancouver and Burnaby and Richmond and New Westminster and Delta and Whistler. And we got this is a City of Vancouver dump garbage truck. And we went to Finning's dynamometer out in Port Kells. UBC supplied criteria air contaminant testing thing, and we essentially replicated the EPA biodiesel emissions reduction chart that a number of the old timers on the call will recognize. Anyway, on the basis of that, City of Vancouver really took a lead in supplying low carbon fuel. So Nadine, over to you for what the city has been doing. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thanks for that great intro, Ian, and thanks for the additional context. I love learning about all of the good work that was done to get us to where we are today. So yeah, my name is Nadine Morris, and I'm a senior engineer with the City of Vancouver's Fleet Engineering Asset Management team. And I'm here to talk to you today a bit about our renewable fleet fuel strategy. Next slide. So a bit of a background of the City of Vancouver's fleet, just to give an impression of the scale. The city has a typically varied sort of municipal fleet of around 2,000 insured vehicles and equipment. This is everything from heavy trucks and equipment for engineering, landfill equipment, bulldozers, compactors, also parks, fire, police. It makes up about 50% light duty, and then a quarter heavy trucks, a quarter heavy duty equipment, very, very roughly. And then we also have a smattering of small equipment, something like, I think we're closer to 3,000 pieces at this point in time. And we have 37 sites where fuel is being delivered. This includes our major works yards for engineering. We also have a number of park sites, and we have, I think, 21 different fire halls across the city. Next slide. So here is a bit of a background on the City of Vancouver's fuel use. This was our fuel use last year. So as you can see, it's about a third gasoline. Almost half is diesel. Of that, we've got 29% of that was, sorry, there's a bit of background noise here just in my office, was renewable diesel. So I do want to make a note here that this was our last year's data. So we have switched fuel suppliers, and we are hoping to drive the share of R100 up to 100% of the diesel that we use. And then overall, we use something like 6.7 million liters of fuel annually. The rest are very small proportion of propane, and we also do use renewable natural gas, which supplies our sanitation fleet. Next slide. Some more information on the renewable fuels piece. So I start my timeline in 2019. It sounds like some work was done all the way back in 2003. But starting in 2019, we started using HRD, so the renewable diesel product. And as you can see, we can really attribute the reduction in our fleet fuel emissions to that point in time. So in 2019, you can really see the fuel emissions on the graph on the left-hand side there start to go down. While our fleet fuel liters have been more or less constant at that sort of 6.7 million liters a year number for the last sort of decade. We've also included that one bar on the graph on the left there, where you can see what our last year would have looked like if we had not been using renewable fuels. This is either the diesel product or the renewable natural gas product. And so really the renewable fuels is what is driving our fleet fuel emissions down. I do need to make a note as someone who works also heavily in the electrification piece of our fleet, that we do have, and we are driving forward electric vehicles, of course, in the fleet. But looking at these graphs here, we really do see that the 200 plus EVs that we have in the fleet have much lesser impact on the emissions piece, seeing as the fuel liters are more or less flat as well than the renewable fuels do. But yeah, the renewable fuels have allowed us to reduce our emissions by around 7,000 tons a year from our baseline in 2018. So good news for that. Next slide. All right, and here's a bit of a timeline. Again, doesn't go quite as far back, but we did adopt B20 at the Toronto station here back in 2017. We started using the renewable natural gas product here 2018. 2019, we started using the R100 product across our entire fleet, trying to replace conventional diesel with the HRD product. And then last year, up until sort of this year, we went out to market on behalf of the BC Petroleum Products Buying Group. So I'll do a little plug for that here as well. And we changed suppliers for all fuels, but also for the HRD product. And so for those of you who are not aware, the BC PPBG, which really rolls off the tongue, consists of something like 70 different members. This includes municipalities and other groups, universities, things like that. And we, as a group, consume around 30 million liters of fuel annually. And the buying group just allows individual members to capture better volume pricing and other efficiencies. All right, next slide. And then finally, I'll just go through a bit of our experience with renewable diesel in particular. So there's been lots said about it at a much more technical level than I'll dive into. This is very much just sort of our experience as a municipality. But I will say overall, it's been a very, very smooth transition. It is a drop-in fuel, which means that it meets the same federal fuel standard, and it's been very helpful for change management on an operational level. Things like ensuring that our operations hasn't needed to change any of their standard operating procedures, either for fuel system maintenance or tracking or for the vehicle maintenance, to accommodate the HRD or blends thereof has been really helpful, because those of you who work in operations understand that change can be tough. So it's been pretty smooth sailing as far as that goes. We've also been able to, through that market sounding and that RFP event that we did last year, note that the availability of HRD has increased substantially since we last went out to market in 2019, which has been really great for us. And we generally, as a city, aim to have 100% HRD. So we don't want to be using a conventional diesel where possible. This does depend largely on supply chain logistics. But we're hoping to kind of increase that as time goes on. In terms of a financial standpoint, we have been seeing HRD follow the ULSD rack rate across all of our market sounding activities, which has been helpful for us in the current economic environment that we face as a municipality. It has been increasingly challenging to absorb additional costs. So this has been something that's really allowed us to continue to use this product. And then the final piece really was there were concerns when we first adopted the HRD product around the cold weather performance. Obviously, Vancouver, we have a pretty moderate climate. We're very lucky here, so gelling is not usually an issue, but that's not always true for the sort of place of origin for the fuel. So the bigger issue for us is that when this happens, it's that we see less than 100%. We've seen sort of HRD deliveries drop to almost 0% in the winter and shoulder months in the past, which is why we are pleased that going forward, we're now able to see blends start to be incorporated in our fuel delivery. So this means that we can both have that cold weather performance and meet the quality standards while still maximizing the renewable content and not kind of see this dip in the winter where we're not receiving the product that allows us to keep our emissions low. So overall, this has been a successful endeavor that's really allowed the city to drive down our fleet emissions in accordance with our greenest city goals. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Nadine. That is a great preview, and we're always grateful for the City of Vancouver's work on fuels. And it's actually a great segue for our next speaker, Colin Weiler from Optimus Technologies. And when we first met Colin a number of years ago, we thought this is a whole lot of an improvement on people who stick straight vegetable oil into their old diesel car and run it up. And the technology has gotten better and better, and interesting, great to follow in the tail of the City of Vancouver. Just having worked with the city over years, at a certain point it got said, well, 20% biodiesel is great, but we want to go 100% renewable fuel. And so I'm going to let Colin run away with that. Colin is the CEO of Optimus Technologies. He's been in the space for a long time. Colin is also a mechanical engineer, so we're at quota on mechanical engineers for the webinar, but it's great to have someone who knows the business space and the engineering space. And Colin, take it away.
Awesome. Appreciate it. And thanks for having us today. And thanks to all the other panelists for sharing insights and the participants on the call. So again, my name's Colin Heiler. I'm the CEO of Optimus Technologies. We are based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We've been around since 2010, helping medium and heavy duty fleets deploy high blends of biodiesel to achieve emission reduction, regulatory compliance, and decarbonization efforts. Next slide. Our technology, again, we were founded in 2010. So we've got a long operating history of working with commercial and heavy duty fleets to deploy 100% biodiesel. And underpinning our strategy for helping and seeing what drives success in the market are a couple key pillars. The first, and this regardless of municipal fleet operations, private fleet, for-hire carriers, really whatever type of emission reduction technologies you're deploying have to be cost-effective at scale. They can't impact the operational performance and duty of the vehicles. Access to whatever energy source or fuel that you're using has to be readily available, validated with data so that there can be auditable trails of information that verifies the emission reductions that are being claimed and achieved. And then at the end of the day, the operators really drive adoption. Although the decision making happens typically, in the boardrooms or at the mayor's office or the political levels, the operators generally tend to deem success of a project by how much they embrace it, and really that means making it seamless to use for them, because their job at the end of the day is collecting the refuse, plowing the streets, delivering the goods, and if you're impacting their operations, it becomes really, really challenging. So we have over 1,300 units deployed throughout predominantly the US, but also some in Canada, with over 340 million miles accumulated on the technology. Yeah, we can go into the next slide. Ian had touched on this, and Scott certainly as well. Very successful deployments of low-level biodiesel blends. Generally speaking, that's up to about a B20. Some manufacturers and other aspects that are embracing slightly higher blends, maybe a B30. But when you start to elevate above that B20 blend limitation, which is something that Nadine had touched on there during the last presentation, B20 generally seems to be about the cap from an emissions control system standpoint, from an operating standpoint, and logistics for biodiesel deployment up to this point. And again, want to reiterate that up to a B20 blend, typically, even in cold weather and winter operations, have resounding success, particularly the advancements that's happened in the industry over a number of years for fuel quality and cloud point and whatnot. But when you get into the higher level blends, there are a couple things that happen. One is you can see crankcase oil dilution. You can see after treatment challenges with the higher flashpoint fuel. And then certainly one thing that folks are intimately familiar, having, if you've ever deployed biodiesel, is challenges with gelling and filter plugging when you get into colder weather operations and higher level blends. So those have limited typically the adoption of biodiesel to those low level blends. Next slide. At Optimus, what we do is we've studied the challenges, we've studied the impacts of how fleets operate and what they're deploying, and how to successfully bridge that gap between a B20 and a B100. Because ultimately, as we progress closer and closer to whether it's an agency target or a corporate target that's been set in the boardroom, emission reductions of 40, 80, net zero targets are rapidly approaching. And so capping the blend level of renewable fuel usage at a 20% doesn't meet the emission reductions that are necessary, particularly in the timelines associated. And we're a firm believer in all of the above technologies, whether it's electrification or ammonia or hydrogen or various things, but looking at it on a carbon intensity basis, a time scale basis, and then ultimately a cost basis. And with that, we see biodiesel as one of the most significant opportunities to provide fleets with a low cost pathway to deploy emission reduction technology and solutions today. So our technology it's a dual fuel system. So it upgrades diesel engines to operate on anything from a B0, your traditional diesel, all the way up to a B100. Never inhibits the engine from running on traditional diesel, but we do have heated fuel system, so tank, what we call our vector manifold, which is a dedicated filter, pump, and processing unit for the biodiesel, and then selector valves that are automated and software controls. And so what we do is we remove that blend limitation, allow operators to run on up to 100% biodiesel without impacting the operational performance of that asset. Next slide. In doing so, we also track the operations and the performance of each individual asset, pull that up into what we call our carbon intelligence platform. That gives fleet managers access to performance data at their fingertips to understand how these fuels are being deployed, what emission reductions are actually being achieved, and then also provides insight to operations and maintenance data that's necessary to integrate into your fleet operations. Maintenance is absolutely critical, regardless of the type of fuel you're utilizing. But our goal and strategy, and for high biodiesel blend deployments, really we see success when it integrates into your existing operations and doesn't require significant additional intervention. Next slide. So a brief overview on the technology and how it works. The system itself can be integrated into existing assets that are already in the field. So if you've got a fleet of trucks or fleet of equipment, our technology can go on as a retrofit upgrade of those existing assets. Typically takes about 20 to 30 hours to install. And so, within a matter of a couple of days, you could be upgrading that asset to a flex fuel vehicle. We also integrate into new engines and new trucks as they get manufactured. We work with a number of manufacturers and ship through partners to make the technology available to end users on new vehicle purchase. From a driver standpoint, they're going to get in the vehicle. We'll always start on traditional diesel, or in some cases, particularly in Canadian operations, that might be a number one fuel. So the engine will always start up on that base petroleum stock. Could be a renewable diesel if you're looking to mitigate that last little portion of fossil usage. So we use a little bit of renewable diesel or petroleum diesel for startup. As the engine warms up, we use the waste heat from that engine to condition the biodiesel. So we're taking the waste heat that comes off of the engine. We run that through a series of heat exchangers. We utilize sensors and pumps and filters that we've embedded within our system to condition the biodiesel. An electronic controller that monitors those parameters. So as soon as the operating conditions are met for suitable use of the B100, our technology will automatically switch from diesel over to the biodiesel. The entire duty cycle and operation will happen on biodiesel. And then at shutdown, when the driver removes the key from the ignition, it'll switch back to that diesel tank. It'll run a flush, purge the engine and the injectors of the biodiesel, and then shuts the engine down on that traditional diesel, or again, maybe that renewable diesel product. What this does is leverages the advantages of biodiesel, the low cost, ubiquitous availability of biodiesel, while mitigating the challenges associated with cold weather performance, higher viscosity of the fuel, and then the after treatment compatibility. And so from an operator standpoint, they get in, they operate that asset, that vehicle with no change. There's no engagement that's required for them. But from a performance standpoint, the biodiesel is going to drive the majority of the operation of that engine. Next slide. And in deploying, particularly into Canada, we needed to validate the technology and make sure operational performance on 100% biodiesel would not be impacted by the extreme cold conditions that are found in a lot of places. So prior to Canada, we have deployed into places like northern Minnesota and Iowa, Michigan, but again, slightly different climate profile for particularly the northern regions of Canada. And so we launched a pilot project with PepsiCo Canada to validate the technology in some of their operations. And before we actually shipped the units up there, we wanted to make sure that we would not have any performance or operational challenges in those extreme weather conditions. So the project that we did with PepsiCo Canada was in Edmonton. These routes were driving from Edmonton to Fort McMurray. And if you go back one slide quick, sorry. We took the trucks that were being deployed. These were new build trucks, both international and Volvo. We took them to a lab here in the States, and it was a cold chamber that we were able to take and recreate temperatures down to about -40 degrees Fahrenheit. So about the same temperature Fahrenheit and Celsius at that point, and validate no performance challenges. Bottom left-hand corner there is actually what the biodiesel looks like in the fuel tank prior to the vehicle's startup. It is not a snow cone, although it looks like it. That is biodiesel directly from the tank. It's a solid mass. And so in this application, it's starting up on a number one, a kerosene, using the heat from the engine to then condition that biodiesel. In addition to the lab performance that we've tested, we also did a 1.3 million mile or about 2 million kilometer validation study with ADM trucking, comparing fuel economy, performance, emission control system operations, and published that report in conjunction with Clean Fuels Alliance America, a number of soybean associations, as well as ADM trucking. That QR code in the bottom corner is a link to be able to download that report. It was a test of 5 B100 trucks compared directly against 5 baseline traditional diesel trucks. Next slide. And so the operation performance we did testing in Edmonton, you can see some of the parameters, how we heat and condition the fuel, but we deployed with PepsiCo again up in Canada. We trained their technicians. Next slide. And out of this, certainly a number of lessons learned, but critical recommendations, regardless of the fuel, the technology deploy, ensure that you've secured the fuel supply first, identify your routing and performance, start with an initial pilot and then scale up. And then, make sure you're measuring performance, the data, the information, and then normalize those all across, what results are, which typically we look at things in a dollars invested or project cost per metric ton of CO2 reduced. And that gives you an ability to compare across renewable diesel, natural gas, hydrogen, things like that, and have a similar normalized outcome. And then based on the performance of your operations and the tests that have been done, scale or not scale. So appreciate the opportunity and pass it off back to Ian.
Thanks, Colin. It's great to see that. And I'm particularly interested to hear about the cold weather chamber testing. And some folks on the call will know that we had a renewable diesel demonstration in 2010 in Alberta, and it would have been interesting to have this technology available at the time. So thanks so much on that. We're running a little bit behind, so I'm going to just continue to progress. If Farah, you could take it to, there we go, bingo. So we have some other heavy duty vehicle, low carbon fuel options, co-processed renewable diesel. I've referred to that a little bit. There are 2 Canadian refineries at least producing it. This essentially takes a refining asset and co-feeds biomass based feedstock into either the fluid catalytic cracker or into the hydrotreater. The hydrotreater is typically what gets used for more of a diesel cut. We also have e-fuels called renewable fuels of non-biological origin is the EU term. They tap a lot of renewable power and CO2. Again, my earlier comment, not really in deployment in Canada, but we do have companies like Expander Energy in Alberta that are working on it. So it's a future fuel, but one that has full compatibility with existing vehicles and infrastructure. Hydrogen fuel cells, a lot of promise, as stated earlier, significant opportunity upside, significant challenges both on most on capex and build out of infrastructure, but may be suited kind of like a B100 model to where you can have that hydrogen. And battery electric vehicle, just in ongoing discussions with our colleagues on the motor fleet sector. Really, the medium duty sector is really where you're seeing a lot of uptake, and that is on drayage, it's on yard to yard delivery. It's on things like school buses, it's on transit buses. So a lot of promise there on the battery electric, more on the medium duty, on the heavy duty, long haul. Really challenged to see pathways currently without significant impact improvements in technology. Next slide. We've also got we've also got an interesting technology that a little bit like what Colin described with the B100 dual fuel. We have combustion of hydrogen in a heavy duty vehicle. Several technology providers in Western Canada, Diesel Tech Industries in Alberta and Hydra Energy in BC, which has done some interesting demonstrations. Today, up to 40% hydrogen and up to 100% is being investigated. So an interesting kind of meld of a gaseous and a liquid fuel, which is why we've wanted to address it. Next slide. We also have renewable natural gas is in the market. California is really the leader in that, and virtually every gaseous fuel or natural gas fueled truck in California is running RNG. They've tapped that out. You can get really low CI fuels from that chart back at the beginning of the presentation on the BCLCFS. You'll see that. And then we have an interesting regional application. The Surrey biofuel plant takes residential green waste and fuels city vehicles and district heating with RNG on a mass balance. It gets pipelined into the Fortis pipeline, and it gets pulled back off on a mass balance basis, but a really interesting application. Next slide. And the last two folks up, we have David Schick and we have Fred Catala from Canadian Fuel Association and Advanced Biofuels Canada, respectively. Many folks will know that Dave is the Western Canada VP, and we deal with Dave a lot on issues where we have overlapping interests. And my colleague Fred Catala is the president of Advanced Biofuels Canada, leads a lot of our advocacy work. So I'm going to kind of just dive in with these two folks, and really the question I want to put out to both of you. You've both been in the sector for several decades plus. You've listened to today's speakers. Is there anything that kind of felt new to you or kind of built on your thinking about how the fuel transition for medium and heavy duty vehicles is going to go? So over to the two of you.
Oh, you got to pass it to one of us specifically.
Well, then Fred, it looks like you're about to take it.
Oh, this is a tour de force. We've got a couple minutes to react to it. A couple things is that it really is very apparent that local in-market leadership is what is moving the needle. What City of Vancouver is doing, what specific operators are doing in specific communities by setting up fuel supply infrastructure is what is actually causing more volumes to go into the market. So it's interesting how you have big picture policy signals like Scott went through with RFS and the CFR in Canada actually causing things to move on the ground. That's a key takeaway. And then, come on, the statement of B50 acting exactly like winterized ULSD if it has additives that are coming onto the market, that's that's tremendously useful for us to hear because biodiesel will absolutely remain relevant. And I think the panel of speakers showed how important the mix is. Over to you, Dave.
Yeah, for me, I think what's exciting is we're starting to see the technologies continue to evolve. And it's not this or that, it's this and that now. So we're looking at all of these different applications using a variety of fuels that are lowering carbon intensity. And I don't think we envisioned liquid fuels getting down to net zero potentially 3 or 4 years ago. The other thing that's refreshing is 3 or 4 years ago, we talked ad nauseum around electrification of long haul transportation. And it was very clear at that time for most of us that it wasn't going to be a factor, although very relevant for medium heavy duty and certain applications and all sorts of niche situations. But we're going to need low carbon liquids for a long time. And as we put more pressure on the grid from other sections of the economy, like artificial intelligence, it even further makes it clear that we need to move in that direction. I think that one of the observations in all of this for me is feedstock. And so we're going to need about 10 billion liters in Canada in 2030 of low carbon liquid fuels. And how do we have the feedstocks that allow us to make those things? So the evolution of second generation feedstocks that are very low carbon intensity, I think is the next step on this journey. And then we also have a trade issue. Decarbonization's come down the list. We talked about that early on. Ian mentioned it because of reliability of supply and trade issues, affordability. We have to keep all those things in balance in order to make sure that we can keep the ball moving in the right direction.
And interestingly, Dave, you mentioned feedstocks and your work at Chevron in your previous role. We're really seeing some of the co-processors bringing in some of the more novel feedstocks like hydrothermal liquefaction fuel, biocrudes and things that are tapping different feedstock streams. So the kind of conventional limitations on food crops is kind of getting blown up a little bit. Just kind of while we've got you both, we've talked about the fuels that are in the market today. When you kind of put on your, out to the end of the decade or maybe even to 2035, how do you see these what do you see being the kind of the fit low CI energy dense fuels? How do you see that transitioning into other technologies? What are going to be some of the triggers?
Seems to be a focus on it's really clear if something is using electricity, you want it to have the lowest carbon electricity. If something is using liquid fuels, you want them to be the lowest carbon liquid fuels. If we can increasingly use for combustion carbon that is recently sequestered, that's long-term beneficial. And a lot of our petroleum resources, of course, we will still be using them. They're a big part of energy security, energy availability. We can also use them for higher value chemicals. So we just have a diversity of sources of energy. And what we've seen is that we can use diesel and biodiesel. I mean, that really did look like an ice cream cone to me, sitting on an engine. I mean, that just shows perfectly how they can work together.
Yeah, I think it's about fit for purpose, and we really need to get into a situation where we understand that different jurisdictions will have different applications. If you're in the area of Edmonton and you've got hydrogen being produced at a lot of refineries, that could be used for local transportation. You could have methane pyrolysis and using hydrogen for industrial facilities and that type of application. Where you have excess renewable energy from electricity, that could be used to produce hydrogen. So there's those types of avenues. And then there's Canada's major advantage is the amount of biomass that we have. And so as those conversion technologies continue to evolve, it's volumetrically not going to be very high. We're going to need vegetable oils and stuff for a long time, but they'll be very low carbon intensity. So we start to build the capacity to continue to feather these things into the system, which can be of tremendous benefit from a carbon intensity perspective.
So we've got thanks, Dave and Fred. We've got a couple of minutes. I want to punt you one last question. We've really stayed more on the technology and applications side on the webinar today, and only touched on policy. But both of you spend the bulk of your time in policy, and so with you here relative to policy, what do you see as the kind of indispensable elements of policy that are going to ensure fleets that they can have low carbon intensity affordable. That's a pretty critical element. Nadine really flagged that for the city of Vancouver. Affordable fuels. What policies are needed, or continuation of policies to make them available?
So I think Colin with Optimus had a really nice line. He said biodiesel is low cost, high availability. A big part of that is that renewable fuel production capacity, especially on the diesel side, responds to volumetric policy signals. So having a very big RVO, renewable volume obligation that's part of the US RFS, that volume signal is what creates the very clear directive to increase production capacity. What helps with lower cost is the compliance credit value. So if you can have a policy framework that gives you a clear demand signal, incorporates volume requirements, carbon intensity reduction requirements, and makes Canadian produced fuels competitive with imports, which is what we saw in the previous, what Scott Fenwick brought up is the estimated 45Z rates. We have to have producers in Canada competitive with imports, and we have to have consumers find affordability with the fuels that they're blended. And that's kind of what regulations are now designed to do. We've got CI signals, volume signals, and a compliance credit market, all within a single regulation. We have that federally with the clean fuel regulations. We have that provincially in British Columbia with their low carbon fuel standards. So we've got a lot of policy ideas out there that can be implemented with differing levels of regulator focus, attention, and full-time personnel. So it's a good time to update policies to incorporate these aspects.
I think it's a nascent market, Ian. It's very critical that we have a situation where we can compete in Canada. It would be very valuable if we saw across the aisles of Parliament that people bought into the value of these development of these fuels in Canada from an economic perspective and industrial policy consideration, not just the environment. Because there's a risk today with the credit values as they are for the clean fuel regulation of it being unsustainable from an affordability perspective. And these are not unanticipated with a nascent market, but we need to make sure that we get these dimensions right so that the market can continue or develop greater confidence in being able to invest in Canada, because our reliance on the US is unfortunately untenable to a large degree at 60% importation when we have the avenues in front of us to build. So I think that there's a bunch of political will that needs to be there, and then a bunch of tweaking within the policies. And I think also getting the provinces more online with the direction will help sort of fortify the overall direction that the federal government has set.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. Great to have your perspective. We've just got a couple more things to do to wrap up. I think, Farah, we have a closing poll, and then we're going to just, if folks want to stay online for a minute or two, we can field some questions. I don't see any in the chat, but I think we can field them from the floor. So Farah, you have the poll to put up to close. Here we go. Post webinar. If you could just kind of hit those buttons, that'd be awesome. Vote quickly, vote often. And Farah, I don't know how we advance to the next question so we don't run out the clock completely, but that's awesome if we can do that. Great. Folks are in question 2. Farah just messaged me to say that all 3 questions are there. You just have to scroll down to answer them. How are we doing, Farah? Are we there? I think we're there. Oh, 70% participated. We're aiming for 80%. And we'll wrap this thing. Okay, let's wrap it there. Lastly, thank you all. Lastly, let's just open the floor for any questions. All of the presenters are still here, as far as I can see. Yes, all the way from Scott to Johannes to Nadine and to Colin and to David and Fred. If you want to just unmute and open up your camera or not, we'll field any questions from the floor. To the best of my knowledge, Farah, we do not have any questions in the chat. Is that accurate? Okay. If you have a question, you can just unmute and pop it out. Okay, I think Farah says that questions that did pop up were answered by speakers along the way. Awesome. Okay, let's wrap there. Again, just a big thank you to Scott, to Johannes, Nadine, to Colin, and also to Fred and David to back end us. My colleague Farah Shaki, our Director Manager of Operations and Comms, has been fabulous. We will be having I think the next slide, Farah, we will be having our next webinar in September of 2026 on sustainable aviation fuels. Fred Gatala leads our SAF work, and so you will see Fred in this chair. And then beyond that, we'll be having rail and aviation, rail and marine. Please follow up with any questions of presenters that were not asked. You have the full set of resources there. Please outreach with any further questions. Thanks so much for attending, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Take care.